Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Andrew Harris and I am a CSPC Program Committee member. On behalf of CSPC, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone. We are about to participate in a very exciting session, the first Short Talk series, Short Talk Session 1. Before we begin, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. Please be aware that this session will be recorded. Please don't forget to tweet about your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2020. There will be a short survey that should only take a minute or two to fill out at the end of this session. I encourage you all to please fill out this survey so we can help to make CSPC better in the future, especially as we're navigating this new online medium. Each speaker has been asked to prepare a 10-minute presentation, after which we will have several minutes for a Q&A. Please ask your questions during each talk. Without further ado, I will now pass things over to our first speaker, Anthony Morgan. Thanks very much and enjoy the session.
Hello, thanks so much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. Very excited to be here. My name is Anthony Morgan. I am a Ph.D. researcher and science communicator. I founded a company called Science Everywhere, and my Ph.D. research explores the topic of polarization in science communication. There is an awful lot of that, and it's a serious problem, and so I think a really good way to start exploring that problem would be to play a game. And so I'm going to ask you a question. Well, I guess you can already see it, and I'd like you to respond in the chat and let me know, do you think we should eat bug burgers or beef burgers? There are several companies around Canada that are interested in producing food-grade bugs, and they're really trying to encourage Canadians to do that. I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that that's a good idea? Should we be eating bug burgers or beef burgers? So there we go. There's the chat. So one person is a huge enthusiast for eating bug burgers. I think I would probably wince at it a little bit, but I think, you know, if it looks like in the picture, I think I would probably wince. But yeah, I can see the argument for eating bug burgers as well. Any other responses? Do you think we should eat bug burgers or beef burgers? I'd really love to know. So hopefully everybody's learned how to use the half and half. You mix it. Okay, interesting. I would ask anybody to share as well, if for whatever side they pick, bug burgers or beef burgers, I would like you to share a surprising or amusing reason that you think other people ought to do the same thing as well. If you are going to make a recommendation about it, what would you recommend people do and then why? And so what I mean, I can see that most people, well, okay, it seems like some people are bug, some people are half and half. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of polarization around this, which is in some ways to be expected. It's probably not something you've got given an awful lot of thought to. But I wonder what would happen if we were to ask a question like that around, let's say, climate change. So we could ask a question like, would a carbon tax be effective? And I'll actually ask you guys, do you think, would a carbon tax be effective, yes or no? And we can do the same thing. We can share why we think that might be the case or it might not be the case. Or we could ask a question like, should we pee in the shower? Slightly less serious, but just as impactful, arguably, from an environmental perspective. And so if you ask a number of these questions and you look at the responses, you can figure out which ones are more polarizing and which ones are less polarizing. We can ask ourselves, well, are we likely to see any movement for a question like the climate change question versus peeing in the shower? And, you know, the answer is obviously yes. People seem to be kind of stuck around the issues of climate change. We wouldn't really need a science of science communication if that wasn't the case. And so you might ask yourself, well, why does this kind of polarization occur for some questions and not others? And so one piece of research actually looked at that problem. There was a paper by Jonas Kaplan, Sarah Gimbel, and Sam Harris, and they were exploring the neural correlates of maintaining one's beliefs, maintaining one's political beliefs. And so essentially what they did was they got together a bunch of self-reported strongly liberal or strongly conservative people, And they would ask them polarized questions like, should gun ownership laws in the US be more or less restrictive? And they would also ask them questions like that were polarized but non-politicized. So questions like, did Thomas Edison invent the light bulb? And they got ratings of their belief strength out of 7, and they specifically selected participants whose beliefs were very strongly polarized, so they were either 6s or 7s. And then they would put them in an fMRI machine and present them with counter arguments to their strongly held beliefs. And so things like 98% of gun crimes are committed with stolen guns. And so arguably having more restrictive gun laws wouldn't really address the problem that we're aiming at. They'd also present things like, somebody had a patent for the light bulb years before Edison did. And then they would measure the belief strength of these participants after presenting them these counter arguments. And so what they found was that people were much more likely to change their mind for non-political versus political beliefs. So the gun ownership or the climate change questions, they were much less likely to change their mind. But for questions like, should we pee in the shower, or should we eat bug burgers or beef burgers, they were more likely to change their mind. And they looked at their brains while this was happening, and they saw that there was really increased activation in areas of the brain like the amygdala and the insula, basically the parts of your brain responsible for your threat response. So one of the researchers said that the response was very similar to what would happen if you were walking through the forest and came across a bear. We also see a lot of activation in this part of the brain called the default mode network, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for sort of keeping track of your identity, so who you believe you are, and parts of your identity that are really core to you, and you value them a lot. And what they found was that these parts of the brain were very active, and you tended to have this very strong threat response. And so you could ask yourself, well, what do we do about this? If people become very concerned because their sense of self is threatened, how can we overcome that? And so the standard response to this point has been something like, well, we can just make sure that we improve people's science numeracy and science literacy, and if we do that, then regardless of the kind of threat that they're feeling, they should sort of become more aligned in terms of their thinking. And the benefit of that is that we can get policy adopted broadly, because there won't be a gap between the public in terms of what we accept. We can agree on what we should all do. And so Dan Kahan asked the question, well, that's a hypothesis we've just presented. And so Dan Kahan and his team asked the question, well, is that hypothesis correct? So they got, again, a number of strongly liberal or strongly conservative people together, and they asked them, how much risk do you believe that climate change poses to human health? And what they saw was somewhat predictable, that liberals tended to rate the risk as much higher, conservatives tend to vote it as lower. But what they found was that as you increase science literacy and science numeracy, or things like the ordinary science intelligence, that polarization doesn't get better, in fact gets worse, which was is surprising and counterintuitive. And so there is a variable that does actually produce or predict depolarization, and that is something called science curiosity. So if you get a bunch of people together and you ask them questions like behavioral questions about their likelihood of exploring science topics, so things like, when's the last time you watched a science movie or read a science book or went to a science museum? If you respond high on that, or you're high in science curiosity, you buried those questions in with a bunch of questions about, well, when's the last time you went to see a sports team play, or you went to an art museum? And again, what they found was that people high in curiosity were likely to become less polarized with more information, as opposed to the other groups. So curiosity seems to have this protective effect that actually depolarizes people. And this was surprising to Kahan and his team, and they don't really know why this happens, but they suspect that people high in curiosity have something that those low in curiosity don't, which is they have the desire to experience the pleasure of contemplating surprising insights into how the world works. And so I call that chasing the Wonder Dragon. These people are more or less, they're addicted to uncertainty. They're addicted to surprise and insight. They consider it a challenge that they can master. Jane McGonigal, a game researcher, argues that this kind of gamefulness mindset is what allows us to reappraise information and to change it from threatening to challenging. And I actually think that this might be the solution to the problem of polarized communication environments, because as it turns out, you cannot be both outraged and curious at the same time. Neurophysiologically, like it's very challenging. It's people who are experiencing curiosity, they have lots of activation in the parts of their brain that are responsible for anticipatory rewards. So it's literally the kinds of parts of the brain that are involved in addiction. So these people are actually addicted to excitement and to surprise. And those parts of the brain counteract the threat parts of the brain. So your seeking system, your curiosity system actually turns off your default mode network and vice versa. So it's actually very difficult to be both outraged and curious at the same time. And so these very different responses are what we're hoping might be the solution to this problem of polarization, that sense of play. And so that's actually what my research was focused on, is trying to see whether or not fostering that sense of play can actually reduce polarization. And so we've created a game with my company, Science Everywhere. We call it the live game of Would You Rather. And in this game, we do something very similar to what we did at the beginning of this. We ask all kinds of questions, things like, should we make robots smarter than us? Should we pee in the shower? Should we design our kids' DNA? And then we'll have people pick a side. And then we encourage them to try to convince other players to pick. So the goal of the game is to try to convince as many other players to switch sides as you possibly can. And that's not tied to moving them to one particular side or the other. It doesn't really matter. It's side agnostic. The goal is just to try to get as many players to switch as you can by presenting them with surprising and amusing perspectives and information that they hadn't considered before. And the third rule is just, if you are surprised or if you laugh, you have to switch sides. And so we'll play several rounds of the game, and so we can see and track players crossing sides in real time across the course of a game. And the question we're asking is, well, if we play this game across time, can we track changes in polarization? Can we see reductions in polarization? In other words, the proportion of players who are willing to see things from another side increase as we increase this sort of gameful, playful mindset. And so the hope is that that will be the case, but I guess I can let you know in about 2.5 years once my research is complete. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd invite any questions that you have.
Wow, thanks so much, Anthony. That was really interesting. And we have a comment from the audience echoing this. They said, you know, not a question, just a comment. This talk is fascinating. Curiosity is more important, or curiosity outweighs outrage. This is really interesting. And we had another question. So this idea that that, you know, it's science curiosity over science literacy, which really reduces the polarization. Mm-hmm. So can you increase science curiosity? So you have this game, which of course you're developing, which is a great avenue for this. Mm-hmm. But does improving science literacy inherently improve scientific curiosity? Do they go hand in hand?
Yes and no. So I'll start by saying that I hope that my intervention will increase science curiosity. I don't know that for sure yet. That's why I say that I'll let you know in about 2.5 years. At this point, we don't know of things that can measurably increase that metric. We don't know of things that can actually increase your science curiosity per se. We have some candidates, but to the question of does science, like what is the relationship between science literacy and science curiosity? Science curiosity comes with a whole bunch of benefits from having a higher level of it. So you do see higher levels of ordinary science intelligence, science literacy, science numeracy. They all tend to come along with that. On top of that, you tend to see higher levels of like empathy and just better retention when you are learning about things. Science literacy doesn't necessarily predict science curiosity, though, so it doesn't seem to be a bi-directional relationship. You can be high in science literacy without necessarily being very curious. So it doesn't necessarily go both ways. One thing I think I will add is that science curiosity is not predicted by your political leanings. So if you're more conservative or if you're more liberal, it doesn't seem to have a bearing on whether or not you're science curious. You can find people on both ends of the political spectrum who are high in curiosity, and again, they tend to become less polarized across time.
Very interesting, yeah, and such a important topic for, right, especially in the world that we live in right now. So I'm sure many people will be interested to hear your results. I think we have time for maybe one more quick question. So do you have some events or ways that people can get involved with your company?
Yeah, so if you just email us at freestyleSocial@scienceeverywhere.ca, we're still very much so, I mean, we aim to gamify this process because games are things that people actually want to engage with. I really try to avoid sort of preaching to the choir when we're doing science engagement, because it's just practically not as useful as reaching people who aren't already very science curious. And I find that gamifying the process is a really helpful strategy for doing that. If people are excited to play this for reasons other than becoming science literate, then they're more likely to play it. And so we're very interested in making this platform available to literally anybody who wants to use it. And so if you're interested in, you know, taking your pet polarized topic and seeing whether or not we can move the needle in polarization with this tool, then we're very much so open to that. And so again, all you have to do is email me. My contact info should be available either through this conference and on my last slide as well.
Yeah, so someone in the chat is asking if we can repost the link. I'll ask that they either connect with you on Twitter. I know are you active on Twitter, or on LinkedIn maybe is a good way to contact you, and then they can get information for your company.
I'd say Instagram is the one we spend more time on, at Freestyle Social SE. I don't know if I can add that to the chat. I can probably add that to the chat. But let's
okay. We'll try to sort that out as we move on to our next talk. Thanks very much, Anthony. So our next, yeah, great. Our next speaker is Shirley. So take it away, Shirley and Scharf.
Thank you very much for this opportunity this morning. Canadian innovation policy, thickening the Canadian innovation ecosystem. This is part of my PhD work. So the issue at hand is really, this research draws on a theoretical framework, the developmental network state, as a promising means to address the issue of what is successful innovation. And the intention of the framework is to understand the dynamics of innovation and how to accelerate key disruptive and transformational technologies. It is American in origin, and the question here for me is, does it have empirical and theoretical force in a Canadian setting? Okay, oh, sorry, I had the slides get away on me here. So the essentials of this framework are really, it's characterized by a post-war period where innovation in America was extremely successful, and it was based on a triple helix of really industry, academia, and university. Very nimble, noted, open to experimentation, and most critical, the capacity of the state in enabling these alliances to grow and groupings to grow across industry, universities, and government. I'm not going to go into the details on this. The literature date on this is relatively new. It's listed there. It has some real challenges in that the notion of the state as broker needs to be strengthened to look at thickening the innovation ecosystem, and it needs to be consistently tested in a Canadian context. The Canadian innovation system trends during the 2000s have been very interesting. There's been a lack of collaboration that's been established, I think, fairly well across, or seen as that, as linkages within this triple helix of academe, government, and industry. Number of reports have spoken to this: the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council, Jenkins Advisory Council on Economic Growth. And while OECD data on this is very spotty, an earlier study did find that we were in middling territory on this, ranking 24th among OECD countries for collaboration, at least between firms and public research organizations. More in the domestic front, there are some significant data gaps. I won't go into the details, and I'll simply jump to the most recent study, however, which has found that only 17.4% of all firms and of all enterprise sizes were participating in innovation collaboration, either internally with their subsidiary or parent or client or customer, or externally with universities or government labs, provincial or federal. So that said, what my research wanted to do, it looks at a number of issues, but it wanted to take a dive on this, make a small contribution to filling some of these gaps, and look at the pulse of the situation. The methodology is pretty straightforward. 54 innovation leaders, senior leaders within their organizations, were interviewed over a period of time in the last several months. And questions were posed around, do we have enough critical mass for innovation, as well as a number of related issues. Substantial effort was made to have a representative group of interviewees, and it included senior officials within government, senior scientists and engineers in the federal side, CEOs within organizations of commercialization and industry associations, universities, colleges, and finally, think tanks and foundations. I also made a concentrated effort to have representation both of the in legacy industries, like we have in natural resources, as well as new areas such as life sciences, if that can be called new, and artificial intelligence. Respondents were also geographically dispersed across the country, and as noted, there were 54 in all to date. So interviewees were provided with an introductory statement that an important incentive for innovation is the strength of critical mass and clusters of innovative activity that assemble not only large corporate actors, but the other groupings: venture capital, universities, government labs, industry, startups, big corps. And they were asked whether they thought Canada is doing enough to create that critical mass. This actually often opened up very deep and insightful comments about the nature of innovation in Canada, the challenges around it, and also potential for paths forward. So the results. Almost 30% of those interviewed felt that Canada was succeeding on this front, but comments were qualified. And in fact, there was no category where people just fully agreed with the statement. Another 24% disagreed and felt that the country's capacity for critical mass was lacking in some respect. And then another 43% clearly diagnosed the problem as, no, we're not hitting the mark on this. We are lacking in critical mass. And 4% of the cases I couldn't really definitively categorize. So in all, just a touch over 66%, 67%, just a touch over 2/3, the respondents were not convinced that Canada was doing an adequate job on the issue of thickening these innovation ecosystems and on dynamic and inclusive ecosystems that can enable innovation. Several interesting and prominent themes emerged, and interviewees often raised more than one issue. 1/3 of the interviewees referenced the significant fragmentation across this triple helix and across the ecosystem, particularly between business and universities, but also across government, with government as well. Partnerships did not appear to be our strength, was a comment frequently. It was likened to silos with very different agendas, very different research versus commercialization, different lexicon, different timelines. And what was puzzling about this, several noted, was there's been a lot of rhetorical agreement on this, but not much progress. Also, 10% felt there was a sprinkling effect across the country where we try to do a lot of smaller efforts of innovation, but it's not focused and strategic enough. A small amount, 7.4%, blamed the barriers on our branch plant dependence, resource dependence, and another almost 4% noted there was regionalization. And what that meant for them was marginalization of certain groups that are seen in the periphery away from the major metropolitan centers to our disadvantage and missing things that are happening there. So what is the assessment? The portrait of Canada's innovation ecosystem was one that was portrayed that was not particularly robust. It was hampered by the size of the country's geography and lack of density of population, a lack of physical proximity for many clusters, and this was still coming out, these interviews were done during a pandemic, a legacy of branch plant economy, and finally, resource dependence. And given these silos of regionalization, dialogue and synergy were found to be wanting. All of this was directly impacting our chances for commercialization of getting through that valley of death and getting products out in the market. And there needed to be a pronounced effort to address this situation. So what is interesting, though, and it emerged in quite a few cases, was there was a real exception to this, and that was in the area of artificial intelligence. And it was frequently referenced as one of the pieces where everything had come together. We had outstanding science and scientific leaders with Hinton and Bengio, solid industrial partnerships, investments by both governments and provincial governments as well, and universities, thickened networks that were inclusive and representative of the key players in the system, including startups. And it was also cultivated and nurtured over time, which I found is a very conditioning factor for this. As one response indicated, AI was an overnight 40-year success. So to conclude, this small contribution, and I want to indicate or caution, still preliminary research. It's just one question among many in the interview. Indicates that inclusion and a fully integrated or thickened innovation economic ecosystem in Canada shows some serious deficiencies. If, as the theoretical framework we employed posits, the success of the innovation in the US has ridden on dynamic and collaborative nature of their ecosystems, and note, the Canadian case seems to lack that same luster. Acknowledging the unique geographic, economic, and sectoral challenges Canada faces, what is signaled in this research is the necessity, even urgency, in overcoming these barriers and enabling the innovation ecosystem to thrive. So thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Asking if you have questions. So one that I was thinking about as you're speaking is that this issue of regionalization, and especially in Canada where we have some remote communities up in the north. So how can we learn from things that are taking place elsewhere in the world to improve innovation in those areas?
So that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a sufficient answer for this, but some of the things that were raised, and it wasn't necessarily based on other international experiences, it was based on experience with rural areas and with the north, for example, is basic infrastructure. You can't get into a highly innovative economy without the kind of basic infrastructure around transport, water, all the things that are needed for clusters to grow. But the other thing that came out as well, and when we think of regionalization, and certainly it is rural and remote areas, but it's also areas that are away from the centers, away from the metropoles. And so those metropoles, as it was indicated to me, attract talent and they attract capital at a much higher rate and in more density than the more marginalized areas do. And what my research showed is there's some wonderful, fresh, interesting innovation going around in these other areas in the country. And in cases, it's not being integrated in the same robust way. I don't know if that answers your question, Andrew.
Yeah, so mainly an issue of infrastructure and investment. So I guess this is one of the reasons why AI has been so successful in Canada.
I would add, just to your last comment, I would also add incentives, right? Incentives that are needed for that. And this comes down to questions of government policy. AI has a unique history. The federal government actually has been investing in AI since 1987. And the early work that was done on this with Canadian Institute for Advanced Research started, I believe, in 1982. We've also had the benefit of brilliant scientists and as well early investment by others. But also there's been a focus on it, and it has grown up with all the dynamics and all the pieces of the innovation ecosystem in place. Can that model be replicated? Because I asked that to folks when they mentioned it at times. And yes and no. Yes, but it requires time. And so if a necessary condition, and I don't know this yet, the research will tell, for an innovation in a country, because our numbers on an innovation gap are challenging, to say the least. If an important aspect of this is this innovation ecosystem and this density of nodes, it also may be, if that's a necessary factor, and a sufficient factor may also be that you need to do it over time, that these needs periods. It was also raised to me that genomics may also be one of these areas where we've been successful at. That's not one of my case studies, so I can't speak to that with great information. But it's not a 5-year deal, and it's not even, R&D is often a 10-year deal. It's a 30-year deal where we grow these clusters and grow these ecosystems.
Right, so something that if we invest now, then we'll see these improvements and the results in several decades. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah.
I was also interested in this idea that it's a lack of collaboration between, for example, academia and industry. So this is something that, as a scientist, I'm just coming out of my studies, I would love to see more. So I guess more companies such as MyTax, who are kind of making these connections, would be a huge benefit to the country and innovation.
Absolutely, you've hit on something. It came out during interviews. MyTax was indicated as one of the really successful programs for that integration. And I don't want to paint a really negative picture here. It's not that there isn't collaboration at all kind of thing, but it is that there are still silos between universities and industry. And this was not coming from either industry spokespeople or university spokespeople. It's coming right across the board. And it's a different structure. It's different timelines for research. It's different lexicon, even language. It's curiosity-driven research versus, well, we have a challenge to get this out on the market. How are we going to do it? And so there were some interesting ideas about funding that could be made on a more short-term available basis, not drawing down from the basic research that's so fundamental in universities, but able to bridge that gap as well.
Excellent. Yeah, this idea of scientific curiosity coming up again. Yes. Great. Thank you very much, Shirley.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Next we have Rodrigo Aliphat and Andrés Blancas. So
yes. Please. Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Go ahead.
My name is Andrés Blancas from UNAM, and we are Rodrigo and me. We are developing some research topics. In this case, we present assessing the impact of COVID-19 in the pharmaceutical industry of Mexico and Canada under the TMEC in Mexico and CUSMA in Canada. Canada-US-Mexico agreement. And in this occasion, we present the effects of COVID on the world trade and the bilateral trade between Mexico and Canada under CUSMA, the pharmaceutical industry in the CUSMA, and the COVID effects on the pharmaceutical binational economic trade, the regional pharmaceutical industrial policy that we get as a conclusion in this presentation. So the introduction of this work is we try to regard the national and bilateral relationships between Mexico and Canada, specifically the pharmaceutical activities, the identification and evaluation of the national value chains between Mexico and Canada is a fundamental task in the resilience strategy for the economic effects of COVID-19 on the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry is a matter of urgent attention, as we can hear in this conference. Is a technological topic, betting on the development of the industrial activities related to health. It could be a better way to take advantage of the free trade agreement signed in the CUSMA. The regional pharmaceutical industry policy could be increased the bilateral value chains and help to figure out the world medicine shortage. So just one important question here is what happened with the COVID in the trade, in the old trade relations in the world. In this slide, we can see that almost has been a generalized downtrend in the third quarter, except from some East Asian economies, as you can see in this slides. Almost all the economies in the world present negative numbers, only except Asian economies like China and Vietnam and Taiwan presented increased exports. So this is a very important point that we identify in this trade relations in all over the world. And what happened with the medicines associated with COVID-19? We identify some increase. The next one, please, Rodrigo. We identify just one increase during the 5 months during the 2020, and almost all the trade trends of medical supplies related to COVID-19 increased almost 74%, as you can see. And then from June to August, there we can identify some decrease in this trade trends in the medical supplies. So here we identify one very important point, that the vaccine appears to be the most promising way to assess the pandemic and revive the global economy. So store recovery to be the truly global and inclusive, it is important for the vaccine to be affordable and widely available. And this point or the vaccine is the solution for the medical and COVID-19 problems and the economic problems? The answer is yes. We have here some very difficult issue that we have to face up just with the relationship between the private sector and the public sector and all over the society. The next one, please. So here, Rodrigo is going to continue with this exposition.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Blancas. I'm going to continue with one question. What was the first effect of the COVID-19 in the bilateral trade? The first effect of the economic crisis caused by COVID-19 was a fall in the trade among the two countries. Graph 3 showed that the exports from Mexico to Canada decreased by 28% between 2019 and 2020. Mexican imports of Canadian goods or Canadian exports to Mexico decreased by around 23%. For Canada, international trade, Mexican exports represent 6% of its total imports, becoming the third commercial partner of this country. On the export side, Mexico is the fifth destination for its exports in the world. In the case of Mexico, imports from Canadian products are the fifth place with 2% of total imports, and exports from Mexico to Canada represent 3% of total exports. That is the second most important destination for export after the United States. Within the commercial relationship between Mexico and Canada, China represents for both countries the second commercial partner in terms of imports. It could be a potential bilateral trade. So, in tables 2 and 3 show the main exports activities between Mexico and Canada. The first column shows the value of exports in millions of dollars, and column 2 represents potential exports between two countries. By using Wyatt, we estimate the potential exports for each country as a result of the difference between the total imports minus the imports for other regional countries. For example, Mexican potential exports to Canada is the difference between total imports of Canadian total imports minus imports from United States and Canadian imports from Mexico. We remark that the potential exports avoid competition between countries into the region. Returning to table 3, the third column shows the ratio between potential exports and current exports. In the case of the manufacture of computer, electronic and optical goods, we find that the current exports can grow up to 4 times their value. In the case of Canadian exports to Mexico, it's observed that the main growth potential is in the manufacturing of motor vehicles. Also, the rest of manufacturers have strong growth potential. Then bilateral trade between two countries has high potential growth. So, what's about pharmaceutical industry in the COSMA? Since NAFTA, the pharmaceutical industry has had incentive to regionalize, highlighting the reduction to zero of tariff rates. As a result of comparing NAFTA with COSMA, we didn't find any significant change. Thus, there is not any trade restriction to develop a regional pharmaceutical production chain. In general, there are 6 classifications of interchangeable pharmaceutical products between both countries. But what is the effect of COVID-19 effect on pharmaceutical binational economic trade? The effect of COVID-19 on the pharmaceutical trade between Mexico and Canada, it stands out that Canadian exports to Mexico have a reduction of approximately 20%. On the other hand, Mexican exports to Canada have a slightly lower reduction, going from around $23 million to $18 million. In other words, contrary to what was expected, the binational pharmaceutical industry was not integrated into the response to the regional demand for pharmaceutical supplies as a consequence of the pandemic. So, but which are the principal pharmaceutical linkage between Mexico and Canada? Regarding trade in intermediate products inputs of the pharmaceutical industry of both countries, Table 5 shows that Canadian pharmaceutical industry demands from Mexico mainly pharmaceutical, chemical, and plastic manufactured goods. These imports represent $26 million. However, they have growth potential of up to 63 times the value of their current exports. In the Canadian case, Mexico demands from Canada approximately $10 million in pharmaceutical, chemical, and plastic manufactured goods. In this case, the growth potential is up to 72 times the value of the current exports. 72. Bilateral trade of pharmaceutical products has extremely high growth potential, and even within COSMA, the industry wants the freedom and the necessary incentives to increase their exports from both countries. Then, okay.
So from this data, as we can see, we identify some potential trading area from Canada to Mexico, from United States to Canada, playing with the three countries in the regional area. We can get some economics of scale, as we call this kind of benefits from the region in terms of regional trade. So according with this estimated data, we identified some, or we said that there are some policy recommendations. First, fostering the intermediate pharmaceutical production in both countries, mainly in Mexico. We can take advantage of the economies of scale as a result of CUSMA and the high potential growth rate, encouraging technological cooperation in both countries, Mexico and Canada. We will develop a more prospective regional pharmaceutical industry, for instance, to get together the vaccine and medicines against SARS-CoV-2. Regional pharmaceutical industry will reduce the North America dependence on the Asian and European markets, as we can see with the data. The medicine shortage to face up the public health emergency as a result of the COVID makes essential an effort for a regional trade integration in the key industries such as pharmaceutical industry. Finally, I would like to point out that the CUSMA agreement offers some very important opportunity to develop the pharmaceutical industry between Canada and Mexico, and we can get the opportunity that CUSMA offers with zero rates in the import and export, and so we can develop the in terms of technology and in terms of knowledge, and we have to take account the very good relation between the industry, the education sector, and the government. So we can work in this way. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Questions?
So for someone who is not involved so much with this world, could you just give a very brief tell us the difference between the Canadian, U.S., Mexico agreement, so the SUSMA and NAFTA? Just very briefly, what are the differences between these two agreements?
The difference is just in mostly in the name. It's not actually there is not a lot of differences, because we are what does it mean CUSMA and what does it mean NAFTA agreement? It's just the free trade agreement, the free trade relations between three countries, Mexico, Canada, and United States. And with the different administration in the United States, mainly by Trump, he decided to change the name just to political issues, not by the economic, because the economic is the same. In the pharmaceutical industry, we keep the same rate, zero rate tax for all the pharmaceutical products. Uh, 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 just interchange it between Mexico and Canada. There is not any tax rate for pharmaceutical products, so it's the same. Just the name is different, I
So
guess.
right. And so you propose this kind of regional North American collaboration so that we can alleviate this kind of dependence in the pharmaceutical industry from Asia. So yeah, I guess how would we go about doing this? And do you think this is a something that's realistic in the short term?
My guess, and we were talking with Rodrigo about that issue. We think that the cooperation among the different commissioners in the government, I mean by the commerce secretary or the commerce or the business commerce, and taking control about the relationship between the different transactions among these countries, we can develop some different strategy of for instance, to develop the vaccine or to develop the products related with the COVID. So and we can take advantage of the free trade agreement. I mean, zero taxes by the different products of the pharmaceutical industry. So just taking more close relationship. How the question is how can we do that? Oh, it's obvious that the government has to take advantage in this or take part in this kind of agreement.
Yes, I think more than free agreement, North America needs a regional industrial policy that could be starts with analyzing the linkage between Mexico, United States, and Canada. So we think it's important relationship Canada and Mexico because both countries have a lot of trade relationships with United States. But what happened with Mexico and Canada? We think this is the most important question for a regional integrate or collaborate.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. So next up we have Janice Parente. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us, so she sent in a video. So please enjoy her video presentation.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the Canadian Policy Centre Conference 2020 virtual meeting. My presentation will focus on the development of national standards for human research and its oversight, and in particular, what national standards are, why we need national standards for human research, how national standards are developed, and how national standards are changing the Canadian human research landscape. I'd like to begin by outlining who develops national standards in Canada. The Standards Council of Canada, SCC, is a Crown corporation that accredits standards development organizations, or SDOs, to develop standards that meet the needs of industry, government, and consumers. SCC accredited SDOs are responsible for the development, publication, and maintenance of Canadian national standards. Currently, 12 SDOs have been accredited since SCC began its operations 50 years ago. You may recognize some of them, like CSA, Canadian Standards Association, a logo stamped on virtually every light bulb, and HRSO, the SDO that develops national standards for healthcare. Among these SDOs is the SDO that I represent, HRSO, Human Research Standards Organization. All SDOs are not-for-profit organizations, and many, like HRSO, do not charge users for the national standards that they develop. HRSO is a Canadian not-for-profit standards development organization. It develops national standards of relevance to Canadians conducting, overseeing, and participating in human research. Its sister company is a conformity assessment organization called Human Research Accreditation Canada, or HRA Canada. The national standards developed by HRSO are used as a basis for HRA Canada's accreditation program. So why do we need national standards for human research? Generally speaking, national standards frame, guide, and normalize almost every aspect of our lives. In Canada, we have national standards pertaining to healthcare, IT, accounting, agriculture, plumbing, electricity, and many others. These promote best industry practices, emphasizing safety and quality, and ensure the interoperability of such practices. National standards eliminate the variability in interpreting regulations, guidelines, and policies, and for human research, provide stakeholders with clear, concise requirements upon which they can build their procedures. National standards promote uniform conduct of human research, creating a research environment that is harmonized and collaborative. What is the difference between a policy, a standard, and a procedure? These terms are often used interchangeably, and this has led to numerous misunderstandings of what governs human research in Canada. First of all, a policy tells us what is important and answers the question, why do I need this? It doesn't tell us what is required or even how to do it. A standard assigns quantifiable measures to something and answers the question, what is required in order to do this? A procedure establishes the proper steps to take and answers the question, how do I do this? You may be familiar with the procedures and their importance in maintaining operations, but without standards, when it comes to human research, we have been basing our procedures on our individual interpretations of policies and other regulatory and guidance documents, making it almost impossible to harmonize our practices and promote collaborations. An example of the interplay between policies, standards, and procedures is something we're all experiencing today: physical distancing. Consider the current policy. Physical distancing must be practiced in order to reduce the transmission of disease. So how would you write a procedure for this policy? Without a standard, we may all interpret this policy differently, and our procedures would vary greatly. However, if we consider the standard, individuals shall remain 2 meters apart, this standard assigns a quantifiable measure to the policy and tells us what is required in order to meet the policy. From here, one can easily write a procedure. Another example of a policy comes from the Canadian policy governing human research, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans. The TCPS2 states, consent shall be given voluntarily. I imagine that human researchers have procedures for obtaining voluntary informed consent from research participants, but that no two procedures are the same, because the level of adherence to this policy is left up to individual interpretation. Currently, HRSO has a technical committee that is developing a standard and assigning requirements for this policy so that Canadian researchers can understand what is required to meet the policy when they write their procedures. How does an SCC accredited SDO like HRSO develop a national standard? Well, the first step in the process is the development of a proposal. A proposal is a document that describes the project need for the national standard, and this project need usually comes from stakeholders. In the case of HRSO, the project need can come from REB members, Research Ethics Board members, researchers, research administrators, Health Canada, or other SDOs, and even research participants, among others. The proposal is transformed into a notice of intent, which is then submitted to the Standards Council of Canada for publication. The draft national standard is developed from the proposal and the notice of intent according to SCC accredited procedures, including the specific way in which requirements are written and expressed. National standards are developed from current policies, regulations, and guidelines, or what are referred to as normative documents. Recall that these documents tell us why I need to do this, and the national standard tells us what is required in order to do this. That is why a national standard is expressed through requirements that are easy to understand, unambiguous, complete, and accurate. A specific technical committee is established to develop the draft national standard. Because the published national standard must meet the interest of all stakeholders, it is very important that technical committee members represent a balance of concerned interest groups and come from all regions of Canada. Another way SDOs ensure that national standards meet the interests of all stakeholders is to release their draft national standards to the public for consultation for a set period of time. At HRSO, our public consultation period is 60 days. All comments and suggestions received from the public are addressed by the technical committee, and the draft national standard is revised if necessary to produce the final national standard. The Standards Council of Canada undergoes a review of the final national standard prior to publishing it to ensure that it fulfills SCC's accreditation requirements. Published national standards are accessible to the public for use free of charge, as in the case of HRSO, and are maintained at regular intervals and revised when there are changes to or new normative documents. All decisions made during the national standards development use the process of consensus decision-making. In general, consensus decision-making is a process for groups to generate widespread agreement in a way that respects the contributions of all participants. Why do we use consensus decision-making? We do it to ensure that all opinions, ideas, and concerns are taken into account and to find solutions that address all members' views, including those of minority groups. Consensus decision-making processes all share the same elements. The process is inclusive. As many stakeholders as possible are involved in group discussions. It's participatory. All participants are allowed a chance to contribute to the discussion. It's collaborative. The group constructs proposals with input from all interested group members. It's agreement seeking. The goal is to generate as much agreement as possible. And most importantly, the process is cooperative. Consensus participants are encouraged to keep the good of the whole group in mind when making decisions. HRSO has published 5 notices of intent, and our first national standard was submitted to the SCC for publication earlier today. We began the development of our second national standard, Ethical Review and Oversight of Human Research, in September and expect to release the draft national standard for public consultation at the end of this year. What benefits can researchers, REBs, and institutions derive from national standards? For researchers, national standards reduce the variability of interpretation when writing or following procedures. They break down barriers to interoperability, leading to harmonization, collaboration, and partnership. They promote regional or specialty research ethics boards. They prevent delays in multi-center trial management. They provide assurance that all ethical and regulatory requirements are being met or exceeded. And they promote successful inspections by regulators and research sponsors, which leads to less downtime, of course. For regulators and funding agencies, national standards broaden the inspection capabilities of Health Canada. They provide funding agencies further assurance that commitments are being met by researchers and institutions. And they help the government oversee a regulatory environment that promotes competitiveness of Canadian businesses and ensures the safety of Canadians. For the public, national standards provide assurance that human research is being conducted safely and ethically. National standards provide assurance that safeguards are in place to protect the well-being of the public when they choose to participate in research. And they promote trust in human researchers and confidence in the data that they produce. And finally, a few words about accreditation. The assessment of conformity to national standards in our industry is called accreditation. If we take Health Standards Organization, HSO, which is another SDO, it develops national standards for healthcare. Its sister company, Accreditation Canada, is the organization that conducts conformity assessments based on HSO's national standards. Similarly, HRSO develops national standards for human research. Its sister company, HRE Canada, is the organization that conducts conformity assessments. Accreditation based on national standards, like the program offered by HRE Canada, provides assurance that national standards are employed in an institution's procedures. It is a demonstration of transparency and accountability for institutions regarding the conduct and oversight of their human research. And it is a worldwide public affirmation of quality. And most important of all, accreditation promotes interoperability between institutions and promotes pan-Canadian harmonization and collaboration. I wish to thank you very much for your time and interest. If you have any questions for me, please reach out to me through the email presented here or leave a comment on our website. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, yes, unfortunately, Janice wasn't able to be here today, but we thank her very much for her participation and for sending in this video. We have one more speaker. I'd like to remind everyone that at the end of this session, we will have the opportunity to participate in a survey. So I encourage you to please do so. And now we'll hear from Eric DeYoung. So please, Eric, take it away.
Great. So hello, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to be here today to present on behalf of CSPC 2020 my presentation, which I'm just about to share in this very instant. Do you see the presentation now?
Nope.
I'm so sorry about this. Not yet. Thank you. So you should now be seeing the presentation. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Eric DeYoung, and I'm very pleased to be here to present Synergy as Canada's comprehensive approach. On August 22, 2001, then United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan suggested in a timely report that the UN adopt a comprehensive approach to ending the Afghanistan conflict. This was before the tragic attacks of September 11, which saw the subsequent launch of a global war on terrorism by the United States. Comprehensive approach is the application of commonly understood principles and collaborative processes that enhance the likelihood of favorable and enduring outcomes within a particular situation. This is according to Canadian Forces Land Operations 2008. Of note, the comprehensive approach brings together all the elements of power and the other agencies needed to create enduring solutions to a campaign. As well, the comprehensive approach is an overarching philosophy for the conduct of a campaign plan. So it's the idea of bringing together everybody to work on a campaign, on a situation, to solve the issue. In 2010, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former NATO Secretary General, said the comprehensive approach not only makes sense, it is necessary. And our own Chief of Defense Staff, General Jonathan Vance, said in the Security and Defense Conference in Ottawa in 2016 that we must implement the so-called comprehensive approach to conflict and risk management. The Americans also said a comprehensive approach to civil-military cooperation is in everybody's interest. So what is this comprehensive approach we're talking about? Well, here you have a matrix that shows the characteristics and operational impact. And we won't go into the detail of the operational impact, but this is the comprehensive preparation of the operational environment that is used in the planning phase for any campaign globally for the comprehensive approach. You can see the characteristics that planners would consider: the theater geometry, for example, geographical and oceanographic characteristics, as well as meteorological ones, but also population demographics, the political situation, the military and security one, economic, social cultural, health and medical, infrastructure, and even the information and media situation. So you can see how actually a comprehensive approach may unfold for a given situation. But implementing a comprehensive approach is as much about management than politics. This research proposed to study the comprehensive approach within a strategic management perspective to understand how. And this innovative approach at looking inside the executive decision-making scheme for complex and multidimensional decisions is pretty innovative. Hence, I adopted a holistic perspective, or a systems-of-systems view, if you'd like, as well as a strategic management ontology and a constructive pragmatic epistemology. In fact, Albert Einstein said we can't solve problems using the same kind of logic we used when we created them. So from this critical reflexivity, I then asked myself, how can we theoretically model the so-called comprehensive approach to make it practical? And this started off my research design with the collection of 615 documents discussing the comprehensive approach. I focused this research basis to form a corpus of 178 documents that were specifically discussing integrated and comprehensive decision-making approaches. And I iterated through grounded theory using document content analysis, an interpretative qualitative analysis, and a statistical meta-analysis combined with participation and observation in order to iterate a typology framework, a theoretical model, and I'm on my way to working towards a full-fledged theory, but at this point I'm presenting the theoretical model. So what? Well, this actually turned into a book from my PhD thesis, and essentially, Synergy better explains the complex dynamics at play within the comprehensive approach. So let me explain you why. Essentially, the book proposes Synergy as its theoretical construct, and also proposes that Synergy represents an integrated practice in lieu of the comprehensive approach, according to a more fundamental management perspective. Canada, moreover NATO and the United Nations, could benefit by applying a synergistic decision-making theory to their future engagements. What's more, a synergistic approach is required to confront contemporary and future warfare and even global competition. So the model is as follows. You have first the situational and context that speaks about the conditions, the space-time, where and when issues are presented. Then you have the society and culture that it speaks to the level of comprehension between people and answers the question who and with who or for who. You would then have the structural and organizational dimension that speaks to coordination and that answers the question what, as well as the systems and processes that speaks about cooperation and answers the question how things actually work and unfold. Then obviously you have the strategies and policies at the top. That is, the talk speaks about consultation and answers the question why we do things we're doing. And the essence of the model is the synergy dynamics dimension that talks about collaboration and answers the question, so what? And what's interesting with the model is you can use one or two dimensions idiosyncratically, but what's more interesting is the added value of employing 5 to 6 dimensions altogether and higher degrees of integration. The statistics yielded, and you can see at the bottom here, the following. So for situation, executives were using about 10% of their decision making on the situational dimension, 15% on society, 20% on the structure dimension, and almost 27% on the strategy. They were using about 14% on the system and 12% on the synergy. What was obvious then was that strategy and structure were the key dimensions used in decision making from a comprehensive and integrated perspective, meaning that oftentimes, for example, executives would look at changing the structure or the strategy to solve social, cultural, or situational or systemic issues, which might not always be the right answer. But what's more important in my research was the emergence of this sixth dimension, the synergy dimension, that explained the sum of the parts, the sum of all these dimensions working together in harmony. Thus, synergy is a function of 5 dimensions: the situation, society, structure, strategy, and system. Synergy does not add value by itself and rarely as a function of only 2 or 3 dimensions, which do not give it enough statistical power for greater effects. It is based on practice, mostly from Afghanistan. It's a new and emerging international phenomenon in international relations. It's talked a lot about synergy, and we'll show you that in a few minutes. In essence, it is multidimensional collaboration. And there are many synergy examples in the literature, and I'd like to give you 2 at this point. Based on the Afghan deployment of forces in November 2010 and in and around the city of Kandahar, where you had 35,000 military personnel and 22 maneuver units. And if you've seen the movie Hyena Road of the same name, well, this is where Hyena Road was located, southwest of Kandahar city. And I'd like to talk about 2 little villages there in the Canadian area of operations, the Nakone village and Belande village, as examples of synergy. So the first is Pashtuns and Nakone. So Pashtuns are elements of society. In Nakone, a situation, which live off of agriculture, a system, do not create much synergy. But if we build a route, an infrastructure or structure, allowing them to sell their produce to bazaar, so the strategy, then we start creating greater effects from these small and simple actions. Or another example in Belande, so a military force, a structure, in Belande, the situation that has for mission reconstruction, the strategy, still does not create much synergy. But if we add an Afghan project team, the elements of society, that learn how to operate a new water and cleaning distribution system, then we start achieving synergy again from these seemingly small, coordinated, integrated actions. So the Canadian government said from the Kandahar experience, it wanted to identify best practices and lessons learned and recommendations for future whole of government operations. And that it hoped that what would be learned will be used for current and future programming in complex operating environments. So I see 6 policy implications of the synergy. The first is the situational relations, or also international relations. Synergy is seen as a new practice. It's more and more talked about, and it's a new way of actually talking about multidimensional collaboration. In terms of societal conflicts, there are new emerging forms of warfare, whether it's cyber, disinformation, and all these new mediums. And creating a synergy is really a way to essentially counter these potentially threats. In terms of structured planning, it's also a deliberate way of planning your actions and doing your analysis, considering synergy as an actual dimension for operations. It's a systems view, so it's really an integrated way of looking at the whole, considering synergy as your outcome or your desired end state. In terms of strategic management, it's part of public value governance, where we essentially try to achieve higher value with the best equilibrium between social practices, situational practices, structural, systemic, strategic, and the synergy itself. And finally, you have the synergy collaboration, which essentially, by definition, synergy is positive, a constructive outcome, and it aims for the greater good. So standalone or silos create more issues. We all know that, particularly for contemporary operations. Henceforth, integration is quintessential, as if we were talking of a Team Canada most of the time, and synergy offers this new, innovative perspective. So I'll leave you with the model in conclusion, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eric. We have a question here. So whose hands do you hope this research gets into?
But looking at integrated approaches in a specific security and defense context. What it was found is that actually synergy beyond the defense and security context also presents a great opportunity for collaboration within different spectrums or different dimensions. So more and more, my second phase, if you will, my upcoming second book, which I won't name for now, but is really looking at how we can apply this idea of creating synergy and collaborative networks, if you will, in multiple dimensions, and applying that to current policy issues, whether it be how we collaborate through the COVID crisis, which was mentioned by researchers earlier. Shirley Ann even mentioned synergy itself, saying that integration was wanted, was needed. So in terms of policy, this idea of synergy is really value added. And I think the model right now has emerged from the defense and security field, which sometimes is particular to its own environment. But I think this time the synergy model presents great opportunity for overall policy challenges we're facing in this contemporary world.
Yeah, and you did give this example of military, but of course this could be applied all across the board. So you give this example of dealing with the COVID-19. Do you suspect that this is something that could be used in basically any policy decision?
Well, it's hard to say that one model or one theoretical model is actually the panacea or the solution to all our problems. That'd be pretty pretentious on my part. What I suggest, though, is that synergy is a really valuable idea, and that if we teamwork together to achieve greater integration and collaboration through the model I've presented. So if we consider, for example, the situation of a given issue, the social, cultural, or the societal aspects of the issue, the organizational structure, the systems and processes, as well as the strategies and policies, but all that in order to create a collaborative, synergistic solution, it's a win-win for just about everybody who participates in this type of decision-making from what I've seen through my research.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. How do you know when to apply this model?
Well, I would say so far, the security and defense domain has been very listening to the model and potential applications. But how do you know when to apply the model? Essentially, you can use it from the planning phase of a given situation. So as soon as you start planning an event or a given solution to an issue, and then you can use it through deliberate actions. So while you're maintaining your actions, you can have feedback, and through statistical analysis of your actions, for example, you can code and categorize and conceptualize your use of synergy to indicate, as you are going through artificial intelligence, for example, how good an integration you're achieving according to the model of synergy. So I think there are different ways to use the model, but the essence of it is really to look at how we can achieve greater collaboration working together.
In one of your tables, you showed that mainly things that people consider is the strategy and the structure. So those were the kind of prevailing elements that people consider when they're making these policy decisions. Is this something that's seen across the world? This was an example from Canada, I guess. So then is it something that we see, for example, in the US, in Mexico, elsewhere? And are there countries which are using this synergistic or something similar to the synergistic model that we could learn from how they're implementing it?
The closest I've found is integrated approaches, and the UN is using, for example, the integration mission planning process. NATO is using the Comprehensive Operational Planning Directive, which also aims to achieve comprehensive effects and more synergy. So yes, there are different applications. In my study, in 615 documents I looked at, there were European, a lot of Scandinavian research on synergy itself. The Europeans were looking into it as well, the Americans. So it's a lot of the Western world conception of how we can achieve greater effects with what we already have using different dimensions. So as you say, a lot of executives by default fall onto strategy and policy and changing structures, for example, as solutions to systemic or social, cultural, or situational issues, which might not always be the best way to approach things. So in a comprehensive, integrated perspective, if you use synergy, you would try to balance better the different dimensions and, for example, do less policy but more execution would be a way to look at it.
Okay, great. And I guess one final question as we're nearing the end here. But so this is something that this model is something that mainly can be applied to policy decisions, as you've said, kind of on a grand scale. But do you see this as something that people could use, for example, in their SME, in their small to medium-sized enterprise, or in companies?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Andrew. I've actually, in an interview, talked about how you can use the synergy model to buy a car. So you would first consider the situation, so where you want to go, the society, so your family might impact your decision to buy a car, right? You might change the color based on what your preferences are and all that kind of stuff. Then you'll consider the structure. Do you need an SUV or a small car, or can you use a community car? And then the systems. Do you want an electric car? You could use the transit or other systems to move yourself around. You don't necessarily need a car. Then the strategy. Why do you really want a car? To move from point A to point B. But then again, as I've alluded to, there's different strategies to get to point A and B. And finally, the synergy would look at all these dimensions together, and then you would achieve a virtuous circle, if you want, of win-win situation in your decision making to buy a car. So yes, I think the model can be applied to different scales, to different issues, to different problems in the policy realm, of course, but also in different situations. As I've shown from my two cases from Afghanistan, they were used in small villages to solve common day problems, building a route or allowing people to manage the water cleaning distribution system. But just that was the added dimension that was missing to create the synergy. And that's how I think the model can be used in different circumstances at different scales and different policy questions and issues.
That's very interesting. And yeah, I guess I'll be using this next time I'm going to be in the market for a new vehicle. So with that, I think we're running out of time. So I'll thank all of the participants. Thank you so much for tuning in from at home or wherever it is that you're tuning in from. I remind you to please stay on and complete this survey. I'll ask, maybe we can have the technical team bring everybody up on stage so they can wave goodbye to the audience. Is that possible? Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And good luck for everyone.
Fun.